Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. I am Malihe Razazan, and with me here is Khalil Bendib.
Tomorrow marks the 16th anniversary of the Abu Salim prison massacre in Libya, when, on June 28, 1996, more than 1,200 prisoners were shot and killed.
I've been in lots of terrible places. I've been in places where human rights abuses are committed, where people are tortured, where people disappear. I've never been somewhere where the government deliberately keeps families living in hope long after their relatives have been buried in a mass grave.
We'll be speaking with veteran British journalist Lindsey Hilsum about her reporting from Libya and her new book, Sandstorm, Libya and the Time of Revolution. Later in the program, Middle East Children's Alliance's Associate Director Ziad Abbas will talk to us about Israel's plans to demolish an entire Palestinian village in the West Bank. All that coming up on this week's Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. June 28th marks the 16th anniversary of the 1996 massacre of political prisoners in the notorious Abu Salim prison in Libya. On that single day, over 1,200 prisoners were shot and killed. This year, for the first time, the victims' families are planning to commemorate the 1996 tragedy without fear of government repression. In her new book, Sandstorm, Libya and the Time of Revolution, veteran British journalist Lindsey Hilsum writes about families still looking for answers and those individuals who survived the massacre. She also brings together an account of the revolution and Libya's history under Gaddafi through the experiences of ordinary Libyans who lived under his rule and of those who took part in the uprising. Lindsey Hilsum is the UK's Channel 4 News International editor and a regular contributor to the Sunday Times and The Guardian. She has covered uprisings in Egypt, Bahrain, and Libya. Among other places, throughout her long career, she has reported from Belgrade in 1999 when NATO bombed Serbia, Baghdad during the 2003 U.S. invasion, and in 1994 she was the only English-speaking journalist in Rwanda when the genocide started. Malihe began by asking Lindsey Hilsum about her first impressions upon arriving in Benghazi.
You know, like most people of my generation, all the way through my childhood, we heard about Gaddafi. Because Gaddafi and Lockerbie, Ronald Reagan bombed Gaddafi. He was this mad dog of the Middle East. That's what Ronald Reagan called him. Gaddafi armed the IRA. So he was always there, but the country was closed. Very few journalists managed to get in. So I was very excited about the idea of getting there. And we came across the border from Egypt, and I covered the revolution in Egypt. And as we came in, there was a big white wall saying, "Welcome to Free Libya." That was written in English. And there was a guy there, and yeah, he looked like Rambo. There was a guy with long hair and a red bandana, and he had bullets in a chain around his chest. And he said he was our guide, and he took us in. And, you know, there were a number of things in that first journey. I noticed how the doors were all painted green. Green was Gaddafi's color. You didn't see many blue doors or yellow doors. And then we got to Tobruk, which is the biggest town in the east of Libya. And Tobruk was going crazy because the revolution had already succeeded in Tobruk. The regime fell very quickly in the east. And people were out in their cars, honking their horns, children hanging out of the window, people waving the tricolour flag, which was, you know, the flag which had been the Libyan flag before Gaddafi and was now the emblem of the revolution, and graffiti everywhere. And some of the graffiti was just sort of messy, and some of it was really fantastic. It was brilliant cartoons, people and paintings. People were expressing themselves for the first time. And after 4 decades of dictatorship. And so I found it incredibly exciting to be there at that moment when history was happening.
You begin your book with meeting up with women and men who had their loved ones killed in Abu Salim prison. Tell us about this prison.
When I got to Benghazi, which is the biggest town in the east, the revolution was centered around the North Courthouse. And on the walls, they had plastered all these portraits of men who they said were the martyrs. So I said, martyrs of what? And they explained to me that these were the martyrs of Abu Salim. Now, Abu Salim was a prison massacre, let me tell you briefly what happened. It was back in 1996. And Gaddafi basically would lock up his opponents. And he had locked up several thousand men in this terrible prison in Tripoli. And the conditions were appalling. People were dying of TB and starvation. And then a group of prisoners who were Islamists rioted. They took 2 guards hostage. They killed 1 guard. And then Gaddafi's brother-in-law, Sanusi, was sent to the prison, and he negotiated with them. And so they thought that they had got a deal, that the sick people were going to be taken to hospital, that they would get better conditions. But in fact, what happened was that they were all herded into this courtyard, and then soldiers were placed on the wall around the courtyard, and they gunned these people down. 1,270 men killed in 4 hours. And this was on June the 28th, 1996. And one of the people I talked to in my book, Wanis al-Asawi, he was a prisoner, he was a survivor, an eyewitness. He told me how he looked through the slit in his cell, and he saw the walls of that courtyard turn red. Now, when I heard about Abu Salim, I felt ashamed for not having known. I knew about Halabja and Saddam Hussein gassing the Kurds. I knew about the big atrocities in the world. I didn't know about Abu Salim. And so I asked if I could meet some of the families of the victims. And so I was taken into this room, and I will never forget this. There were about 15, 20 women on one side, the same number of men on the other. And they were each holding up a black and white photograph of the father or son or brother who they had lost. And they were in complete silence. And then a little old man came forward to tell his story, and he was wearing that dark red fez, the very traditional Libyan hat, and he had big dark rimmed glasses. And he told me, he said it was my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, and every couple of months we would travel the 600 miles to Tripoli with her and his children to take food and toiletries and clothing. And the guards would say, "You can't go and see him, but leave the stuff with us on the gate." And then he said, "We did this for 14 years before they told us he was dead." And I just gasped, because I've been in lots of terrible places. I've been in places where human rights abuses are committed, where people are tortured, where people disappear. I'd never been somewhere where the government deliberately keeps families living in hope long after their relatives have been buried in a mass grave.
And you say, as we said our goodbyes, another woman thrust a small blue envelope into my hand, the kind used by old-fashioned photography shops. I opened it in my hotel room and found a faded color passport picture of a round-faced boy with thick black hair in a cream shirt, and a similar size photograph of an older man with white hair wearing black fez and a traditional black robe, a jirt fringed with gold brocade. A closer look reveals that it's sitting in a wheelchair. His legs, which are covered in white bandages, have been amputated at knees. When you opened your hand and you looked at that photograph, you say that you realize that old woman gave you that photo because she wanted you to be a witness.
Yeah, those people had never spoken to a journalist before. And that was because Libya was pretty closed. It was hard for journalists to get in. And they had hired a lawyer sometime earlier, and they had started to negotiate with the regime from about 2003 onwards to try and find out what happened. And it was so important to them to tell their story. And I've kept the photographs that old lady gave me because, they sort of became emblematic to me of this terrible massacre, which I had known nothing about. And I would look at these 2 men, this boy and this older man, as I was writing the book, and I was, who were they? Why were they in the prison? He'd lost his legs. This was a man with no legs. Did he lose his legs in the prison? Did he lose his legs before? Was this a different story? And to me, they became the symbols of the suffering of those men and women that I met that day.
Lindsey, when you went to Libya, were you directed by your editors to cover certain aspects of the uprising, or you were free to pick the stories you thought were important to cover?
I work for a television station that trusts me. And basically we went there to get the news, to find out what was happening.
You followed and reported from the front lines as the rebels advanced. In your view, how representative was the uprising, the initial uprising in Benghazi, and the rebellion of the mass opposition to Gaddafi's rule?
I think certainly in the East they did. I think that the East was traditionally opposed to Gaddafi from quite a long way earlier. And so I have no doubt that in the East they very much did want to overthrow him. And most of the men in the rebel brigades, you know, they were doctors, they were students, they were lawyers, they were workers, there were all sorts of different people. I think that it was a slightly different story in Tripoli. I think that, you know, there were still people who supported Gaddafi in Tripoli. And in any system, there's people that support the government who gain from the government. In the book, one of the people I talked to, whose story I tell, was a young woman who had worked for Gaddafi. She worked in the protocol department, and she had this sort of extraordinary gleam in her eye. I mean, she hero worshipped him, really, and I think he was, you know, very charismatic for some people. And she always called him the guide, and she would never believe that he had done anything bad. She would say, oh, it was the people around him who did something bad. And obviously there were other people who had benefited from Gaddafi's rule. When he first came to power in 1969, I think he had huge support. And when this handsome young army officer, 27 years old, seized power, people thought, great, you know, now Libya's going to happen. We're going to become like Egypt, you know, next door with Nasser, in charge. And one of the things I have in the book is an archive of photographs that were found in the government buildings after Gaddafi fell. And you see him looking so handsome, and you see him with Brezhnev, and you see him with Yasser Arafat and so on. And it's quite amazing to look back on that. But, you know, as time went on, his economic theories, well, they ended up with empty shelves and people stampeding to when banana boats came in because there was nothing to buy. And people's properties were confiscated. And then people would turn on the television in Ramadan, and they would get home after, and have the evening meal after the fasting, and they would turn on the television, and there would be the gallows and people hanging. He hanged his opponents in public to make sure that Libyans knew what would happen if he opposed them.
Not only they televised it, but they also took children into stadiums and public places to watch people being hanged.
Absolutely, and they did that in the universities. In 1977, there was a big purge in the universities, getting rid of anybody who was Muslim Brotherhood or any other kind of grouping other than following Gaddafi. And yes, they erected gallows on the campuses, and they made people go and watch the hanging. And that was to tell people, that's what will happen to you. Don't you dare oppose Gaddafi.
And there is no statistic of exactly how many people were killed or disappeared.
That was one of the things I tried to find out when I was researching the book. And I asked, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and all Libyan human rights organizations. Nobody seems to know. And that's because quite often people would disappear, and then the families would never hear. And so they didn't know. And I mean, for example, Hisham Matar, who's a very famous Libyan novelist, his father, who was a member of the opposition in exile in Egypt, his father disappeared when Hisham was 14. And he is researching to this day to try and find out what happened. He's a famous person. There are so many Libyans who are not famous, who are trying to find out what's happened to their missing relatives.
One of the women you profile in your book, Mervat Mahni, she founded an organization called Mafqout, which means disappeared. She basically set up a website where people could register the names of family members they had lost. And she only collected 600 names.
Yeah, initially, Mervat set up that organization after the revolution. And she set it up because her cousin, a young man, was killed just as Tripoli fell. And for 3 days, his parents, her aunt and uncle, were trudging around the mortuaries trying to find out where he was and so on. And she said that in some ways, those days of not knowing were worse than when they found out that he was dead. So it takes you back to Abu Salim and the families not knowing for all those years. But so then she thought, well, she would set up something to help other people. And she was initially just thinking, of people who had disappeared in the revolution. And she was very clear that it should be people who supported Gaddafi and people who didn't support Gaddafi. This was going to be for everybody. And quite often she says that people who rang her, they'd say, my son was last seen in Sirte, for example, which was Gaddafi's stronghold. And it was quite clear from what they said that this was a Gaddafi soldier, a Gaddafi supporter. She said, fine, I'm going to help everybody. And then people began to ring her and say, well, my husband disappeared in the 1990s or the 1980s. And so she's at the point now where she says, I've probably got a lifetime's work ahead of me because Libya is a land of hidden graves and secrets.
You do write about atrocities of Gaddafi and his regime, but you also write about what the rebels had done, this cycle of revenge and going after those who were perceived or deemed to be working with Gaddafi. From the beginning, some of the images coming out of Libya showed how African migrant workers who were accused of being mercenaries and working for Gaddafi targeted. You write in your book also about this tribe called Tuarega. They lived in a shabby neighborhood in Misrata, and from what I understand, the whole community has been displaced and put in camps.
Well, that's right. You see, Gaddafi, it's a cliche and it's classic. It's divide and rule, and that's what he did. And Gaddafi, he provided weapons and he provided money for certain of the Libyan tribes, and particularly the more Africanized and more black tribes. And there's a lot of racism in Libya, and there's a lot of racism amongst the rebels.
And you confronted one of them.
Yeah, absolutely, because basically, if you take the Tuarega are a particular group of people, about 30,000, and they lived in this village outside of Misrata. Misrata is a big trading post. And Gaddafi built that village for them and put them there, and they were his people. And so when the rebellion started, it was natural for him to turn to them to fight for him, which they did. But many of the Tuareg actually worked, they did the sort of more low-level jobs within Misrata, street sweepers and that kind of thing. And they fought for Gaddafi against the rebels. Now, the Misrata people say that the Tuareg men were involved in rape. Now, I have no evidence of that. I'm sure rape happened, but I have no evidence that it was specifically Tuareg men or that, because it's a very, very delicate and difficult subject. But that was what people said. So that meant that there was a particular hatred for them. And when the rebels won, basically they took their revenge. They went through and they burnt Tuareg to the ground, the village. They chased the people out. And I met some of the Tuareg who had been chased out, who by then had got to Benghazi and were sheltering in an old cement factory. And they had nothing. And I'm sure that some of them had done bad things. I mean, there's no question that some of them, there's no question that meant that they fought for Gaddafi. But, we're also talking about women and children. And we're also talking about, I think, a deep problem in Libyan society, which is the issue of racism, because there were also mercenaries. Gaddafi paid people from mainly West African countries to come and fight for him. And now, if anybody is black, they're immediately suspect.
But many of them were just simply migrant workers.
Absolutely. And many of them had nothing to do with it. I mean, they were just workers. But they have become suspect because there's not really proper law and order yet in Libya. And you have these different militia who, control their own areas. Human Rights Watch estimates that there are between 5,000 and 8,000 people who are being held by the different militia in different parts of Libya now. Some of these people have been tortured. And so you've gone from a situation which, the human rights abuse was appalling. And I learned in the writing of the book, I understood why people needed to overthrow Gaddafi. But, that doesn't mean that what comes next is completely fine. I mean, the rebels are not angels. And there's a huge problem at the moment of armed men basically doing what they like and no law and order.
So why do you think people wanted so much to overthrow Gaddafi?
Well, I think that there are a number of issues. One is the brutality, and Abu Salim, that you kill 1,270 men. That touches a lot of families, a lot of clans, a lot of tribes. And, because we're talking about a small population, there's only 6 million people in Libya. So that one massacre, that really affected a lot of families. But I think it was also to do with the Libyans' consciousness of themselves. I mean, Gaddafi had been there for 42 years, and Libyans, they're like anybody else. They're modern people. They had this sense of a world out there.
And very educated.
Highly educated. I mean, in Britain, many of our doctors in our National Health Service are Libyan. And I think that they found Gaddafi embarrassing in some ways, that this man was representing them on the world stage. And then in the latter years, his sons, they had formed a kind of mafia, really. And oil money was coming in. The country was developing in that sense. It was getting rich. But a lot of that money was going into companies which were controlled by the family. And people resented that. Some people, resented the sons even more than the father, because sons they just saw as people who were taking, and all these stories would go round of them partying in Europe and using prostitutes and so on and stealing the country's money.
And that's Lindsey Hilsum, the Channel 4 News International editor and a regular contributor to the Sunday Times and The Guardian. Lindsey covered the revolutionary uprisings in Egypt, Bahrain, and Libya, and she's out with a new book called Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution. We'll continue our conversation after a break. From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. For those of you joining us now, I am Malihe Razazan, and our guest this week is Lindsey Hilsum. She's Channel 4 News International editor and a regular contributor to the Sunday Times and The Guardian. We're talking about her new book, Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution, which brings together an account of the revolution and Libya's history under Gaddafi through experiences of ordinary Libyans who lived under his rule and those who took part in the uprising. When I was reading your book, I realized that the campaign to get answers in what really happened in Abu Salim, what happened to those prisoners, is what really ignited this revolution.
What was interesting, it's like there were two triggers, because obviously there was a wildfire, which spread from Tunisia to Bahrain and Egypt and then into Libya. And when Mubarak was overthrown in 18 days, there's no question that was what set Libyans off. But they were supposed to begin their revolution on the 17th of February. And on the 15th of February, the lawyer for the Abu Salim families, Fatih Tervil, he was arrested. And then the Abu Salim families jumped the gun. They went out and started demonstrating 2 days before the agreed date. And so one of the things I love about the Libyan revolution, it was basically started by a bunch of little old ladies. They were the ones who went out there. And they had been the ones who had been going out and demonstrating for several years. But this time, other people joined them. And this time, because of what had happened in Egypt and Tunisia, there was no stopping people.
How did you see firsthand the role that women played in this uprising?
Well, it was really interesting because, the actual war fighting was basically done by men. And I think a lot of what we saw and reported were the battles along the coast road and the warriors in the Nafusa Mountains and in Misrata. And I didn't realize until I went back and started to research the book in more depth the role that women had played, because a lot of the role that women had played had been quite secret. For example, there were female doctors who were running secret hospitals for the rebels. I have the story of one young woman she's very conservative Muslim, and she wears her headscarf and her long coat. That made her a perfect spy because she's like invisible. And so she's walking around Tripoli. Gaddafi is still in power, and she's clocking the troop movements, and she's looking for where weapons are going. going and so on, and sending out these reports. And she was eventually caught, and she spent time in Abu Salim prison. One woman whose role was sort of almost accidental in that when she became very famous, which was Iman al-Obeidi, who was stopped at a roadblock in Tripoli and taken away by some of Gaddafi's forces, and she was raped. And then
she's the one that we saw in Al Jazeera.
She's the one that you saw in Al Jazeera and so on. Because she then, when she was finally released after a few days, I mean, she felt that her life was ruined anyway. And so she thought, well, I have to say what happened. I have to tell the truth. And so she burst into the Rixos Hotel, which is where journalists were staying. I wasn't there at the time. My colleagues were there. She burst in with her story. And that story of how she had been raped by Gaddafi's forces, I think that had a huge impact internationally, because it was such a terrible thing which had happened to her. And then the goons in the hotel tried to stop her telling their story. They drew knives. They smashed people's cameras. They were so determined that she shouldn't speak. And she was brave. She was desperate. And I think that story touched people all over the world. And it showed the bravery of Libyan women, of that Libyan woman to speak out, but also the terrible things that they endured.
But that story took another turn because she slipped out, ended up in Qatar, and then she was brought back to Benghazi because the Transitional National Council wanted to use her to score points with Gaddafi.
Yeah, she became a commodity. The poor woman, I mean, she'd endured this terrible, terrible thing. And then eventually she managed to escape. She got out of Libya, and she went to Qatar, and the Qataris sort of looked after her. But then the rebels, who were being supported by Qatar, decided, I mean, basically she was some kind of a public relations thing for them. Look at this woman, and terrible things have happened to her, and that's because of Gaddafi. And they said she had to go. They took her. They kidnapped her to Benghazi. She didn't want to go there. She needed time. She needed space. She needed therapy. She did not need to become a poster girl for rape. I mean, what a horrible thing.
So have women been able to carve up space for themselves?
I think it's
in
a
the
big
public
fight.
sphere.
I think it's a big fight because, there are definitely women who want to do that, and I tell some of their stories in the book, but. You know what it's like. It's always the same. That men say, you get to the end of the revolution, the men say, thank you very much, dear. Would you like to go back to the kitchen now? I mean, it's happened, it's happened all over the world. It happened in Britain after World War II, that the women worked in the factories and so on, and then the men came home from war and you were told, sorry, men need those jobs. And so you have a similar thing going on in Libya. I like what Mervat Mahani, the one who's running this organization to try and find the missing and who took part in a civil disobedience campaign in Tripoli. She said, the men say to us, you women don't have the experience to take part in politics now. But I say to them, well, you don't have the experience either. We've all been living under dictatorship for the last 4 decades.
So you don't have the experience either.
Exactly.
Basically.
But I think that the women are going to have to fight for it. And it's quite a divided society between secular and Islamist. And if Libyan women want to participate, and I certainly know many who do, I don't think it's going to be handed to them on a plate. I think that they are really going to have to struggle for that role.
How prominent was the role that Salafis and Al-Qaeda played in the rebellion against Gaddafi in the uprising?
Well, I think that initially we didn't really see the Salafis, and I think that they kept themselves hidden from the Western press as much as possible. But then we became aware that they were there. But they were a slightly sort of mysterious presence. There's a town called Derna, which is east of Benghazi, between Benghazi and Tobruk, which has always had a reputation of being a very conservative town and where there were a lot of Salafis and Islamist movement. And that has seemingly grown since the revolution. So they're certainly around there. And then what I found was that after the revolution, it's just people's different priorities. There were Salafis who were driving around and they think that there should not be shrines in mosques. And so they were destroying shrines which went back to the 15th century because they see it as idolatrous. It seems so extraordinary. It seems so extraordinary to somebody like me that should be your priority. You have a country which has basically no state. You have no law and order. You really need to get a system of government going. But their priority was the destruction of shrines. And there's been some very alarming developments recently, which is that there's been an attack on the International Red Cross office in Benghazi, and that seems to be by Salafis who don't understand what the International Red Cross does at all. They say, it's a Christian organisation. Of course it's not a Christian organisation. You have the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. It works in all Muslim countries. And they've also attacked a British convoy and the US consulate. Yeah. So they're clearly there, and they're clearly active, and they are clearly turning to violence to try and get their own way.
And there are news of drone attacks.
This is very interesting. We have no evidence that there are American drone attacks in Libya, but what there appear to be are drones which are surveillance over the Derna area. And I think that this is it's a very dangerous development, because at the moment Libyans are very fractious and divided. Well, that's what you would expect. You can't expect everybody to think the same thing. And they're also NATO intervened basically on the side of the rebels to protect civilians, ostensibly to protect civilians, but that was what ousted Gaddafi. And so people are many Libyans are very grateful. They're very grateful to America, to Britain, to France. The moment there's a drone attack which kills people, whoever they are, Salafis, non-Salafis, I think that will change very quickly.
When you say Libyans are grateful of the role that NATO played, but at the same time, they did kill civilians, and NATO has been acting like an institution that's above every international law, so they're not accountable to anybody or anything.
That's absolutely right. And civilians were killed, probably between 50 and 100 from the surveys that have been done. There was one particular incident where they clearly had got bad intelligence, and they attacked a house and they killed a family. And that family is trying to get compensation, and NATO is not owning up to any of this stuff. And that, I presume, is because they fear lawsuits and so on. It's interesting, the different Libyans I've spoken to, some of them are very clear that NATO should pay compensation and NATO is responsible. Others say, well, these were casualties of war and that was a price we paid for freedom. There was an incident of a NATO strike when I was there which had killed some of the rebel fighters. And I went and, the bodies were being buried. And I was expecting people to be angry. I would have been angry. But the people there said to me, no, they're martyrs. And then somebody even said to me, well, they'd been shooting in the air and a NATO aircraft was going overhead. No wonder NATO attacked them. It was very hard to see who was pro-Gaddafi and who was anti-Gaddafi. So I found, for me, a very surprising tolerance of the killings by NATO.
But the other thing that you point out in your book very clearly is that after seeing what NATO was targeting specifically in Tripoli, you realize it's about regime change. It is not just about saving civilians. So this NATO's mission, it was not really about saving civilians or protecting the civilians. It was more about regime change, wasn't it?
Well, I think that obviously the UN Security Council mandate was about protecting civilians. And the first thing that happened was a French attack on a convoy of Gaddafi tanks which were about to enter Benghazi. And I have no doubt that saved civilians, because Gaddafi had said that he would hunt down his enemies Zenga, alleyway by alleyway. And I think that he meant it. And I think that you would have had bloodshed, slaughter in Benghazi, and I think you would have had huge numbers fleeing to Egypt. But yes, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that mandate was stretched to regime change. Gaddafi had very few friends left in the world. The Arab League, they wanted him out. They had enough of him. He had a rather annoying habit of trying to assassinate other Arab leaders, which doesn't go down well, They didn't like that. And so they had turned against him. And I think that the French, the British and the Americans, they had been on the back foot through Egypt and Tunisia, as if they'd been on the wrong side of history. And so they saw an opportunity to be on the right side of history, because they thought that Gaddafi was going to go. And, Gaddafi didn't really have any friends left. But the slipping of that mandate, it going from protecting civilians to regime change, of course, that has many implications. And one of the implications it has now is for Syria, because the Russians tolerated the idea of protecting civilians. But when they saw it meant regime change, they said, never again. Never again. We're not going to allow through another resolution like that for another country, because of the whole issue of sovereignty. So I think that intervention that we saw in Libya, I think that's the last one we're going to see for a long, long time.
Let's talk about the relationship between the West and Gaddafi, which went from Ronald Reagan calling him the mad dog of Middle East to George Bush saying, quote, old hostilities don't need to last forever. Tony Blair called him a leader to make common cause with. So how did this relationship with the West change over time, especially after 9/11, from hostility to a close alliance? And you say that this history was carefully omitted just prior to NATO's action in Libya. So, Lindsey, how cozy was his relationship with the West?
Very cozy. And that's why when people say, oh, NATO intervened because of oil, that doesn't make any sense, because the Western oil companies were doing very nicely under Gaddafi.
And especially British Petroleum, who
BP,
had gotten a lucrative investment.
Absolutely. BP was doing very nicely under Gaddafi, so was ExxonMobil. They didn't have any problem operating under Gaddafi. So the idea that, the intervention was because they wanted the oil, they already had the oil. So I don't think that stacks up. But, I think that Gaddafi was very shrewd and very clever. And he had decided that he wanted to be rehabilitated. He decided this sort of, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And when 9/11 happened, it was a question of my enemy's enemy is my friend. Because the people trying to overthrow him were jihadis, were Islamists, many of whom were based in Afghanistan. And so he said to, George Bush and Tony Blair, look, these are the same people who are against you. They're against me too. Let's work together. And he was our friend in the war on terror. So Abu Salim, all the atrocities, Lockerbie, all of the things that Gaddafi was involved in, that was all conveniently forgotten. He bought a huge number of weapons in the 70s. I mean, unbelievable number of weapons, mainly from the Russians, the French, the Italians, the British to some extent, pretty much everyone. And then he was just getting back into the weapons purchase business before he was ousted. But you know what? He had so many weapons already lying around. I have never seen anything like it. Just outside of Ashdabia, which is a town near Benghazi, went into a place with these bunkers, and just hundreds and hundreds of rocket-propelled grenades and mortars. Some of them hadn't been taken out of their wrappings, and they'd been from the 1970s.
And something else about Gaddafi was his collaboration with the United States after 9/11 in the rendition program.
Yeah.
In your book, you have a very, very interesting story about the Islamic fighting group, the LIFG, and Sami al-Sadi, and what happened to him.
The Libyan Islamic fighting group were the jihadis who wanted to overthrow Gaddafi, and they were based in Afghanistan. And after 9/11, they were displaced. They were on the run. And there were two leaders, Sami al-Sadi and Abdul Hakim Belhaj. And they ran from Afghanistan into different places, and they both ended up in, of all places, Guangzhou in eastern China. And then both of them were caught. Sami al-Sadi, whose story I tell in some detail, arrived in Hong Kong, and they realized that he was traveling on a fake Moroccan passport. And so they looked him up, and they found out that he was a wanted man.
He first ended up in Iran.
He did. He went to Iran. Yeah, he fled from Iran and then Iran to Malaysia and so on. But basically what happened then was, the Hong Kong police or security authorities contacted the British and the Americans, who contacted the Libyans, because at this point the CIA and MI6 were working very closely with Gaddafi's Secret Service. And they collaborated in the extraordinary rendition, which means the kidnap, of Sami al-Sadi and his wife and 4 children, and they were bundled on a plane, blindfold, and taken back to Libya. When he got to Libya, they were taken to prison, and he said Musa Kusa, who was Gaddafi's spy chief, and this is so chilling, came in and said to him, Sami, the world has become very small. That it used to be that I couldn't find where you were, but now I can just call up CIA or MI6 and I can find out where you are, and you can't hide from me anymore. And Sami al-Sadi, he was in Abu Salim for some time. And now both he and Belhaj, who was his colleague, are suing the British government because the documents came out. And I mean, this part of the story, I spoke to Sami al-Sadi and I got his story, but I also have documents to back it up, because these documents were found, which were documents which went between MI6 and the Libyan security services and the CIA and the Libyan security services. And it's all spelled out there, how the 3 collaborated in the extraordinary rendition of these 2 men.
You write extensively about how weapons got into Libya through so many different routes, Qatar and Kuwait and the United
UAE,
Arab UAE.
Yeah.
And Belhaj was involved in one of those brigades. There was a close relationship between American special forces, British special forces. Tunisia was involved. They were being trained in Tunisia, some of these rebels. So talk about the extent of the foreign involvement in bringing down Gaddafi's regime.
I think the foreign involvement was absolutely critical because the rebels, they weren't that great as a guerrilla army. A lot of them were, doctors and lawyers. They'd never picked up a weapon before. And they were losing the war. Then the UN Security Council resolution went through and NATO got involved. But NATO didn't want to be seen to be giving weapons to people. And I don't think they did give that many weapons, but what they did was they facilitated weapons coming from other places. Now, one of the issues about the whole Arab Spring is the role of Qatar. Qatar, this tiny little country, 350,000 people, is the richest country per capita in the world. And they have become extremely involved, and they backed the rebel movement there. They're backing the rebels in Syria. Why? Why are they doing this? I mean, I have a number of answers, and I cannot tell you definitively, but I have a number of things I point out. One is that they clearly want to punch above their weight. They dwarfed by Saudi Arabia next door. Their sheikh is more liberal and so on, and they host Al Jazeera, both the Arabic Al Jazeera television and Al Jazeera International, which is English, which is a project of the sheikh, and so they have that sort of liberal outlook. But they also have, I think, what they would probably call a moderate Islamist outlook. And I think that they think that there has to be a kind of Islamism which works, which isn't jihadism, which isn't Osama bin Laden.
But at the same time, they gave quite a lot of attention to Belhaj on Al Jazeera.
Well, they did. They gave a lot of attention to Belhaj on Al Jazeera, and Belhaj and others. There's another sheikh called Ali Salabi, who's basically Muslim Brotherhood. And there's no question that they support these people. And so one would surmise then that what they're trying to do is they're pushing Islamists across the region. But I think that you have to make a distinction, because I don't think they're pushing Al-Qaeda. I think they're very against Al-Qaeda. But I think that they are pushing a kind of Islamism which would be, a very conservative form of Islamic government. And that, there are some people in Libya who are very resentful of that, and they say, well, thank you very much for the weapons when we needed them, and now would you like to go back to your own country?
What you say is that officially the special forces weren't there, but their presence was, yes, but their presence wasn't much of a secret. It says a dozen British and similar contingent of French arrived in Benghazi in early April. But what you say is that according to local men who worked as a translator for them, plane loads of Qatari weapons had started arriving within a few days of UN resolution. The first few boxes were unloaded, were medical supplies, but the weapons were underneath. The Qataris sent an estimated 20,000 tons of weapons, but not all of them went through the British and French pipeline. An unknown number went directly to the February 17th Brigade under the command of Sheikh Ali al-Salbi's brother Ismail, which was fighting on the Eastern Front. Emir of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Abdel Hakim Belhaj, another author of the book written by the jihadis who went through de-radicalization, was involved with similar brigades.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you have these Islamist brigades, and they are getting... they were getting weapons from the Qataris. And so the issue now is what role will the Qataris play in Libya? Because some Libyans I know, are very resentful that they say that Belhaj is basically the puppet of the Qataris, and they don't want that. That they say that Libya should be independent. Belhaj would reject that. And, that's one of the things that we're going to see play out in the coming months and years, the role of the Gulf states in Libya and this division between secularists and Islamists. That's going to be the fight for power in Libya.
You were in Libya during the revolution and after the revolution. What are your hopes and fears for Libya?
Libya has a small population, 6 million people. It's a rich country. They have oil and gas, and they've got their oil and gas production up to pretty much pre-war levels. They are, as we've said, highly educated people. They have a lot going for them. But then you look and sometimes you wonder, because Gaddafi didn't believe in a state. There were no proper institutions of government. He was like the spider at the center of the web. And then the revolution cut the web away, and now there's nothing. And the men who are the interim authorities These are old men, and they're academics and business people. And, Mr. Al-Kib, the interim prime minister, he was a professor of electrical engineering at Michigan State University. These are not strong leaders, and they're not really respected by the young men. And the young men will not put their weapons down. So you have a certain amount of anarchy, and you have a power vacuum. Now, they're supposed to move towards elections, and it's not until they have elections and some kind of legitimate government that I think that there's any chance of establishing law and order in Libya.
I read a piece in The Guardian that quoted a woman human rights activist in Libya. She says, "We got rid of Gaddafi, but not the regime." She points to the secrecy of the National Transitional Council, which, despite promising democracy, keeps its meeting secrets, refuses even to disclose its full membership. She says, "We did not do a revolution and our people did not die to bring back a new dictatorship."
Well, and that is absolutely one of the debates that's going on now. The National Transition Council is extremely secretive. There was one young woman I met, she said to me, "You know what our problem is?" She said, "We've all got a little Gaddafi in our heads." So maybe when we look back at the legacy of Gaddafi, we can see the problems of the Libyan infrastructure, we can see all the human rights problems and the suffering, and maybe in the end, the long-lasting legacy is what's in people's heads. It's the psychological legacy, and that's what will take Libyans the longest to overcome.
Lindsey Hilsum is the UK's Channel 4 News International editor and the author of Sandstorm, Libya and the Time of Revolution. For more analysis on Libya, go to jadaliya.com.
From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. The Palestinian village of Susia in the occupied West Bank has existed for centuries, long before the Jewish settlement by the same name built in 1983. And it's now on the verge of being demolished by the Israeli authorities, an act that will make 350 people homeless overnight. Khalil spoke with Ziad Abbas of the Middle East Children's Alliance about the impending destruction of Susia.
Ziad, as we speak, an entire Palestinian village in the West Bank in occupied Palestine is in danger and on the verge of being demolished and erased from the map. For Israel, driving Palestinians out of their homes is nothing new, and it's been going on for a while. But how is this case in Susia different from previous cases?
Actually, when we speak about settlements and Israeli policy in the West Bank, we are speaking about the entire West Bank. This is the Israeli policy since 1967 until now. The same way they did in 1948. With Susia, actually, it's different a little bit because the entire village, they will be swept. And the Israeli court decision is very clear about that. They want people outside of their land. Because the settlement there, which the most radical settlers in Palestine, they are living in Hebron area. They are very close to the government. At the same time, there were a plan since 1982 to push people out of their land. And they succeed. In 1986, they pushed people out of their land. They moved and they lived in the caves in the area. Mm-hmm. And after that, they built their own villages. Here we speak about around 350 people living there. Among them, 120 children. 60 houses, including school, clinic, community center, etc. Even in the court, they didn't offer people another place to stay. They want them out.
So this village, as you mentioned, has been around for centuries, the original village of Susia. And in 1983, a Jewish settlement was built.
Yeah,
there.
Susia, the new settlement, it's carried the same name. And this is the period, actually, when they pushed the people. And to go back to the history, people in Susia, actually, the Palestinian people, the indigenous people, they have documents that they own the land in a private way. The families there, they have documents since 1830 and since the Ottoman period, actually.
Yes.
Part of the people, actually, they were uprooted in the Negev area. And they moved from Negev and came to Sicily to live with their tribes. So the documents which they shown in the government and the court didn't make any sense for them. The only thing it helps them in 1999, actually, when the court took a decision to ask people to leave, they succeed the lawyers of the people in the village to freeze the decision and to keep the people in the land in 2001. But June 12th, the decision was very clear from the court that they want the people to leave in 3 days. And right now they are applying for the Supreme Court. They are waiting to see what will happen.
So these people who have been there for more than a century now, they were there before the foundation of Israel.
Absolutely.
And yet, somehow, these people who have petitioned the court to expel and demolish the houses of these Palestinians, they claim they're the residents and the Palestinians are somehow settlers. The language is very interesting.
If we go back to the Israeli policy and try to analyze which kind of laws they use inside Israel, and to answer this question, it will take some time, actually. Here, Israel, since 1948 until now, they use different kind of laws to legitimize their policy. For example, they use the Ottoman laws, not all the Ottoman laws, part of the Ottoman laws which serve their goals and serve the goal of the Israeli government and the Israeli occupation. They use the British laws, including the emergency laws, 1945, to legitimize their policy. They use the Jordanian law. They use the Egyptian laws. Jordanian and Egyptian laws because West Bank was under the Jordanian rules between 1948-67. Gaza Strip, it was under the Egyptian rules between 1948-67. And Israel, they use their own laws, what we call it Israeli laws, which they have it from the Knesset. And in addition to that, they use the military orders. Because Israeli occupation in the West Bank is a military order. So they have, since 1967 until now, they have over 1,500 military orders. The settlers, they, of course, because they were a decision in 99 in the court, and here the Palestinians, they try to play the game with the Israelis, try to use their own laws to challenge the Israeli policy, because this is the way how the people, they try to defend their land.
They try to use Israeli law in order to defend themselves against Israeli displacement.
Especially they have all the documents to prove that the land belonged to the people living in the village. But when they took the 1999, the decision, and they asked people to leave, they took the decision because this area, it's archaeology. And they have a synagogue, historical synagogue that built in that area. So the Arabs living there, they should move. This is a Jewish area.
So this is
the claim. They claim that they want to use the land in that period.
So the original rationale for displacing the Palestinians from their village was that this was a quote-unquote archaeological site.
Absolutely, and they tried to say the land, it will be a state land. But in reality, they said that with many other settlements like Ma'ale Adumim, they said that with Efrat, they said that with Ariel, they said that with many other settlements. This is like the land belonged to the country because as a historical place, but in reality, they do build settlements and they expand the settlements. And here the Israeli laws, they are very clear. They support the settlers, and this is the policy actually, and they make it difficult for the Palestinian people to live in their land, and especially in that area when you speak about Hebron area. In that area where they close the circle of settlements, they need to, the Israelis, they are planning to expand Sosia settlements, take the land from the Palestinian settlement. Sosia is not that much far from Yatta town. People, they are living there since hundreds of years. They own the land. Even they are living in very bad conditions. They don't have electricity. They don't have water. They destroyed the water resources there. And they tried to make it difficult since 1982-83, since Sosia settlement built in that area. But in this period, actually, the radical wings, I can say, and the radical settlers in Hebron area, they pushed the decision of the court in 99 to be approved and to take a place to practice this and push the Palestinians out of the land. And here the court, absolutely, it's a military court and it's an Israeli court. It served the Israeli government, of course. They gave 3 days for the people to apply for the Supreme Court. And right now there is a case. But I think the Israelis, they don't care about the Palestinian rights, despite the fact this is an area, it's occupied area in 1967, and according to international law, it's a violation.
And what they call civil administration is really military rule.
Civil administration, it's a military rule. When I am in my refugee camp, in Daesh refugee camp, I used to go to apply for example, driving license. I need to apply to the civil administration.
So
civil administration, in reality, they are officers and they are wearing military uniforms and they treat you as you are going to jail and they investigate you. Civil just to make it nice word, but in reality, it's a military occupation.
So it's Orwellian use of language. It's actually military occupation that they call civil administration. Even these people are never elected by any Palestinians to rule over them. This is just straight occupation.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about the Hebron area, all the Hebron area, you have different kind of settlements. Even you have, according to Oslo Agreement, which Sosia, the village, it's in Area C. It's under Israeli control. But in Hebron area, for example, you have Hebron Area A, Area B, Area C, according to Oslo. And there is another agreement, which between Arafat and Netanyahu, 1997 and 98, called Hebron, where H1, H2 divide, special agreement. But in reality, Israel, they continue with this policy around Hebron and confiscating more land, not just in Yatta or in Sosia. There are many other areas where they face this kind of problem. For example, in Beni Naim, in Beit Ummar, in Hebron itself, inside Hebron. Everyone hear about the Shohada Street in Hebron, which Palestinians, they are not allowed to open their shops. And it's closed since 1982 until now.
So what is the exact status right now? Last week we were worried that the court might give the permission to demolish the homes. And what is the current situation?
I believe there are a certain kind of pressure coming from different countries because they are not allowed to get electricity inside the village. So the German organizations, actually, they funded a project there to use the sun to have the electricity.
Solar.
Solar. And there is certain kind of community. They have a protest. A few days ago, there were hundreds of people and international activists. Even some activists came from Israel.
So what do you recommend people do? I mean, to put pressure to help with this particular case?
The only way here, the people, they need to protest everywhere. They need to raise their voices against this. This is a violation of the human rights. There is no Israeli laws, what we call it Israeli laws. It's a military order. And there is a plan. It's an ethnic cleansing plan. People, they need to raise their voices. They need to protest. They need to send letters. They need to call. They need to support the community there in the ground and stand with them. This is the only way where you can challenge the Israeli occupation.
So where should they write? Is there a website we can direct them to?
Yeah, absolutely. There is the biggest campaign, Stop the Wall campaign, stopthewall.org. They can actually go to our website, www.meccaforpeace.org, where you can get more information. This is apartheid policy by the Israeli occupation. People, the best way right now to do it is to boycott Israel, to raise their voices, to use the same process that they use when they were in solidarity with the people in South Africa. This is very clear, racist country using their military rules to uproot the Palestinian people from their villages and from their towns. And the people, they need to join the BDS movement and support the BDS. This is the only possibility to do right now.
Ziad Abbas is the Associate Director of the Middle East Children's Alliance. From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa.
And for this week, this has been Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. We look forward to your comments and suggestions. You may reach us by email at vomekpfa@yahoo.com or by phone at 510-848-6767, extension 632.
You can download the podcast of our program on the archives page of Voices of the Middle East and North Africa at kpfa.org. Voices of the Middle East and North Africa is produced at the studios of KPFA in Berkeley. Join us again next week for another edition of Voices of the Middle East and North Africa.